Welcome to another journey into the shadows of American history. I'm glad you found your way here, to this quiet corner of the forgotten past, where the stories we're about to uncover have waited more than a century to be told. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Are you listening in the early hours, when the world outside your window has gone still? Or perhaps during a long drive through empty highways? Tell me in the comments below your location and the hour on your clock. There's something strangely comforting about knowing we're all gathered here, scattered across different time zones, united by our fascination with the dark corners of the past. Tonight's story takes us to Louisiana, 1892. The place is a decaying sugar plantation called Bellefontaine, nestled along the murky waters of Bayou in St. Martin Parish. The date is October 28th, the eve of the harvest, when the cane fields stood tall and the air hung, thick with the sweet, almost sickly scent of ripening sugar. On that night, something happened at Bellefontaine that would scar the memory of an entire parish for generations. Something so disturbing that even today, more than 130 years later, the descendants of those who witnessed it speak of it only in whispers, if they speak of it at all. The central figures of our story are Elijah Dunham, the 52-year-old master of Bellefontaine, a man whose family had built their fortune on the backs of enslaved people for 3 generations, and his wife, Margaret Dunham, née Thibodeau, a woman of 47 years whose reputation for religious devotion was matched only by whispers of her merciless temperament. But there was a third figure in this tragedy, a young woman named Cora Mae, 28 years old, who worked in the main house. Cora Mae was the daughter of formerly enslaved people who had remained at Bellefontaine after emancipation, trapped by debt, by circumstance, by the invisible chains that replaced the iron ones. What happened between these 3 people on that October night would set in motion a chain of events that still defies complete explanation. Because on the eve of the harvest, Margaret Dunham orchestrated a public punishment for her husband, a ritual humiliation witnessed by workers, neighbors, and even the local reverend. It was meant to be a lesson in morality, a demonstration of righteous judgment. But something went terribly wrong. By dawn the next morning, Cora Mae had vanished without a trace. Within a week, 3 more people connected to that night would be dead under mysterious circumstances. And in the decades that followed, those who ventured too close to the ruins of Bellefontaine would report hearing sounds that should not exist, voices singing in languages no one could identify, and screams that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. This is the story of what Margaret Dunham did to her husband on the eve of the harvest. But more than that, it's the story of what that punishment unleashed, and of the secrets that the Louisiana soil has kept buried for over a century. To understand what happened at Bellefontaine, we must first understand the world in which it occurred, a world that existed in the peculiar twilight between the Old South and whatever uncertain future lay ahead. By 1892, the Civil War had been over for 27 years. Slavery had been abolished. Reconstruction had come and gone, and the brief window of hope it had offered to black Americans was slamming shut with brutal finality. In Louisiana, the systems of control that had defined the antebellum period were being reconstructed in new forms: sharecropping, convict leasing, black codes, and the ever-present threat of racial violence that would soon crystallize into the horror of Jim Crow. St. Martin Parish, where Bellefontaine stood, was a place caught between worlds. The Cajun French. Traditions of the region mingled uneasily with Anglo-Protestant influences. Catholicism and evangelical Protestantism competed for souls. And everywhere, the legacy of slavery hung over the land like Spanish moss, visible, pervasive, impossible to escape. The Dunham family had arrived in Louisiana in 1807, purchasing their first enslaved workers within a year of settling. By the 1850s, they owned 112 human beings and cultivated over 800 acres. Of sugarcane, the wealth they accumulated built Bellefontaine, a grand house in the Greek Revival style, with 12 white columns and a gallery that wrapped around 3 sides. But the war had not been kind to the Dunhams. Elijah's father had died in 1863, killed not in battle, but by a fever that swept through the Confederate camps. His older brother Thomas had returned from the war, missing his left arm and most of his sanity, dying by his own hand in 1871. By the time Elijah inherited Bellefontaine, the plantation was a shadow of its former self. The fields overgrown, the house in disrepair, the fortune depleted. His marriage to Margaret Thibodeau in 1874 was meant to save him. The Thibodeau family of New Orleans possessed what the Dunhams had lost: liquid capital, social connections, and a reputation untainted by the failures of war. Margaret brought a substantial dowry and a promise of respectability. What she also brought was a religious fervor that bordered on obsession. Margaret had been raised in the strict Calvinist tradition, and she approached her faith with the same merciless logic that her family applied to business. She believed in predestination, in the absolute sovereignty of God, and in the visible signs of election that separated the saved from the damned. She also believed, as many of her contemporaries did, that the preservation of racial hierarchy was part of God's divine order. Parish records from the 1880s paint a portrait of a woman feared even by those who publicly praised her piety. She established a Sunday school for the children of the plantation workers, but former attendees would later describe an atmosphere of terror rather than spiritual nurturing. She organized charitable works for the poor, but always with an accompanying lecture on the moral failings that had led to their poverty. A letter preserved in the Louisiana State Archives, written by a neighbor named Josephine Melançon in 1887, offers a glimpse into Margaret's character. In it, Melançon writes to her sister, "Mrs. Dunham attended our gathering yesterday, and I confess the temperature of the room seemed to drop several degrees upon her entry. She has a way of looking at one, as though she can see directly into the soul, and has found it wanting. Even Reverend Thibodeau, her own cousin, seems uncomfortable in her presence." As for Elijah, the historical record suggests a man quite different from his wife. Accounts describe him as quiet, somewhat melancholic, prone to long solitary rides through the cane fields. He had been educated in Virginia before the war, where he developed a love of poetry and classical literature that his wife considered dangerously frivolous. In the privacy of his study, he kept volumes of Keats, Shelley, and Byron, authors Margaret would have considered spiritually suspect at best. The marriage produced no children. Whether this was by choice, by circumstance, or by divine judgment was a matter of speculation among their neighbors. What is certain is that by 1892, the union had become one of cold formality. Elijah and Margaret occupied separate wings of Bellefontaine. They appeared together at church and at social functions, presenting a united front to the world. But those who worked in the house knew the truth, that husband and wife sometimes went weeks without speaking a word to each other. It was into this frozen marriage that Cora Mae entered. She had been born at Bellefontaine in 1864, the daughter of a woman named Delphine, who had been enslaved by the Dunham family since childhood. After emancipation, Delphine had stayed. What choice did she have? And Cora Mae had grown up in the shadow of the big house, learning to cook, to clean, to sew, to make herself useful, and therefore tolerable to the white family who controlled her fate. Cora Mae's education had been acquired in secret during the years when teaching enslaved people to read was still technically illegal in Louisiana. An elderly house servant named Abraham, who had learned his letters from a sympathetic minister decades earlier, had passed his knowledge to the young girl during stolen moments in the kitchen. By the time she was 15, Cora Mae could read and write with a fluency that would have astonished and perhaps frightened the white family she served. She kept this ability hidden, of course. In the world of 1892, Louisiana, a black woman who could read was a threat to the established order, a reminder that the supposed intellectual inferiority used to justify oppression was a lie. So Cora Mae played her part, the quiet, obedient servant who kept her eyes down and her thoughts to herself. By 1892, she was working as a domestic servant in the main house, responsible for maintaining Elijah's study and personal quarters. She was known among the workers for her quiet dignity, her skill with herbs and remedies, learned from her grandmother, and for a singing voice that could make even the most hardened field hand pause in his labor to listen. The songs she sang were old, spirituals passed down through generations, work songs from the cane fields, and strange, wordless melodies that she claimed to have learned in dreams. Her mother Delphine often worried about her daughter. There was something in Cora Mae that refused to be broken, a spark of defiance that showed in the set of her jaw and the directness of her gaze. In a world designed to crush such spirits, Delphine feared what that defiance might cost her child. Exactly when her relationship with Elijah Dunham crossed from service into something else, no one can say with certainty. Some workers would later claim it began when Cora Mae was dusting in the study and Elijah caught her reading one of his books, not just looking at the pictures, but actually reading the words. Instead of anger, they said, he showed curiosity. Instead of punishment, he offered more books, and in those shared moments of literary discussion, something dangerous had taken root. By the autumn of 1892, rumors had begun to circulate. Whispers passed between workers in the fields, knowing glances exchanged when Elijah lingered too long near the kitchen house. Questions about why the master's study door was so often closed during the hours when Cora Mae was supposed to be cleaning. The discovery happened on the morning of October 26, 1892, 2 days before the night that would change everything. Margaret Dunham was not a woman who snooped. She considered it beneath her dignity to concern herself with her husband's affairs, trusting that his fear of God and of social ruin would keep him within the bounds of propriety. But on that morning, she entered his study to retrieve a family Bible that contained genealogical records she needed for a letter to relatives in Virginia. What she found instead were letters, 17 of them, bundled together with a blue silk ribbon and hidden in a false compartment at the bottom of Elijah's desk drawer. The letters were written in 2 hands. One was Elijah's distinctive script, which Margaret knew well from 18 years of marriage. The other was less polished but surprisingly eloquent, the handwriting of someone who had been taught to read and write in secret, practicing by candlelight when the work of the day was done. The contents of those letters have never been made public in their entirety. The originals were supposedly destroyed in a fire at the St. Martin Parish Courthouse in 1908, and the only record we have of them comes from fragments quoted in later depositions and from the testimony of those who claimed to have seen them. But even the fragments are enough to understand why Margaret's world shattered that morning. According to a deposition given in 1903 by Samuel Broussard, the plantation's overseer, one letter from Elijah contained the following passage: "When I am with you, I remember what it felt like to be alive. For 18 years I have been entombed in this house, in this marriage, in this life I never chose. You have shown me that there is still beauty in the world, still tenderness, still hope. Whatever happens, know that you have given me a gift I can never repay." Cora Mae's response, also quoted in Broussard's deposition, was more: guarded but equally devastating. I know what we are doing is dangerous. I know what they would do to us if they found out, what they would do to me. But when you look at me, I am not a servant. I am not the color of my skin. I am myself, whole and seen. That is worth any danger. Margaret spent the rest of that day in her chambers. The house servants reported hearing nothing from behind her closed door. No weeping, no prayers, no sounds of destruction. Just silence, heavy and absolute. That evening, she summoned Samuel Broussard to her sitting room. Broussard was a complicated figure in Bellefontaine's hierarchy. The son of a white Cajun farmer and a free woman of color, he occupied an ambiguous position, too dark to be accepted by white society, too connected to white power to be fully trusted by the black workers. He had served the Dunhams for 15 years, and he knew more about the secrets of the plantation than perhaps anyone alive. What Margaret said to him in that meeting has never been fully revealed, but Broussard's later testimony suggests that she made him an offer he could not refuse, a substantial sum of money and the deed to a plot of land in exchange for his assistance in what she called a necessary correction. The following day, October 27th, Margaret set her plan in motion. She sent word to neighboring plantations, inviting them to Bellefontaine for what she described as a gathering of Christian witness on the eve of the harvest. She summoned Reverend Josiah Thibodeau, her cousin, from his church in St. Martinville. She instructed the kitchen staff to prepare food and drink for 50 guests, and she told Elijah nothing. The morning of October 28th dawned grey and heavy. A thick mist rolled in from the bayou, blanketing the cane fields and muffling all sounds beyond the immediate vicinity. Workers later described an atmosphere of oppressive stillness, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Elijah spent the day as he always did before a harvest, riding through the fields, inspecting the cane, consulting with Broussard about the work schedule for the coming weeks. He noticed the preparations being made at the house, but assumed Margaret was organizing one of her prayer meetings. He had long since stopped attending such gatherings. As for Cora Mae, she went about her duties in silence. If she sensed that something was wrong, she gave no sign of it. A worker named Isaiah Green would later recall seeing her hanging laundry behind the kitchen house that afternoon, humming a melody he didn't recognize. Something old, he said. Something that sounded like it came from far away and long ago. By 6 o'clock, the guests had begun to arrive. They came in carriages and on horseback, dressed in their Sunday finest, despite it being a Tuesday evening. The white plantation families from the surrounding area filed into Bellefontaine's grand parlor, while their servants waited outside with the carriages clustered together in the gathering darkness, exchanging uneasy glances. At 7 o'clock, Margaret descended the main staircase. She was dressed entirely in black, as though in mourning. In her hands, she carried the bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon, and her face, according to all who witnessed it, bore an expression that one guest later described as terrible in its calmness, the face of a judge about to pronounce a sentence of death. What do you think is happening so far? Tell us in the comments, because what came next would shock even those who thought they understood the capacity of human beings for cruelty. Margaret's voice cut through the murmur of conversation like a blade through silk. "Brothers and sisters in Christ," she began, "I have gathered you here tonight to witness a reckoning. For too long, I have been a woman deceived. For too long, sin has festered in this house, hidden behind closed doors and whispered lies. But the Lord has opened my eyes, and what I have seen cannot be unseen." She turned to Samuel Broussard, who stood by the parlor door. "Bring him." Elijah was escorted into the room by 2 field workers, men who had known him their entire lives, whose families had been owned by his family. His face was pale with confusion and the beginnings of fear. He had been summoned from his study only minutes before, told that his wife required his presence urgently. He had come expecting news of a death or a disaster. Not this. "Margaret," he said, his voice unsteady, "what is the meaning of this?" She did not answer. Instead, she held up the bundle of letters. "Do you recognize these, husband?" The color drained from Elijah's face. He lunged forward, trying to snatch the letters from her hand, but Broussard and the workers held him fast. Margaret stepped back, her expression unchanging. "For the benefit of our witnesses," she continued, "I will explain. These letters document an abomination. For over 2 years my husband has been conducting an illicit affair with a Negro servant in this house, a woman named Cora Mae." A gasp rose from the assembled guests. In 1892 Louisiana, such an accusation was not merely scandalous, it was potentially lethal. The unwritten rules of Southern society held that white men might do as they pleased with black women, but to love one, to treat her as an equal, to write her letters as though she were worthy of such attention, that was a betrayal of everything the racial order was meant to protect. "Margaret, please," Elijah whispered. "Not like this. Not here." "You should have thought of that before you brought shame upon this house and upon the memory of your ancestors," she replied. "You will confess your sins before these witnesses, or I will read every word of these letters aloud." What followed was something between a trial and a ritual humiliation. For over an hour, Margaret interrogated her husband before the assembled guests, forcing him to answer questions about his relationship with Cora Mae in excruciating detail. When he tried to refuse, she would begin reading from the letters. When he tried to minimize or deny, she would produce specific passages that contradicted him. The guests watched in a mixture of fascination and horror. Some would later claim they wanted to leave, that they felt sickened by what they were witnessing, but that something, whether propriety, fear, or a darker curiosity, kept them rooted in place. Others would admit in later years that they had felt a kind of satisfaction in watching the proud Elijah Dunham brought so low. Elijah wept. He begged. He tried to explain that his marriage had been loveless from the start, that he had found in Cora Mae something he had never known existed, genuine affection, intellectual companionship, a recognition of his humanity that his wife had never offered. But his explanations only made things worse. Each admission was another nail in the coffin of his social standing, another proof of his betrayal of the racial order that the entire system depended upon. Reverend Thibodeau stood beside Margaret throughout, occasionally interjecting with quotations from Scripture about the wages of sin and the fate of adulterers. He spoke of Potiphar's wife, of David and Bathsheba, of the lake of fire that awaited those who succumbed to carnal temptation. He would later claim that he had been as surprised as anyone by the nature of the gathering, that he had believed he was attending a prayer meeting, but his participation in what followed suggests otherwise. At approximately 9 o'clock, Margaret announced that the time had come for judgment. "My husband has confessed his sins before God and before this community," she declared. "Now he must demonstrate his repentance. Bring the woman." Cora Mae was dragged into the parlor by 2 workers. Unlike Elijah, she had clearly been forewarned, or had sensed what was coming. She had been found hiding in the root, cellar beneath the kitchen house, clutching a small bundle of belongings as though she had been preparing to flee. What happened next would be described differently by different witnesses. Some would claim that Margaret ordered Elijah to publicly renounce Cora Mae, to declare that she meant nothing to him, to call her by names that no human being should be called. Others would say that the punishment was physical, that Elijah was forced to participate in Cora Mae's beating, to strike her, himself as proof of his rejection. The most disturbing accounts, however, suggest something far stranger. According to a deposition given decades later by a woman named Celestine Landry, who had been a child servant at Bellefontaine at the time, Margaret had prepared a ritual that drew on practices far older than Christianity. Celestine claimed that symbols had been drawn on the parlor floor in what looked like ash mixed with blood. She said that Margaret had produced a small book, not a Bible, but something else, something with a black cover and pages that appeared yellowed with age, and had read from it in a language that no one present recognized. The mistress made them stand in the center of those symbols, Celestine testified in 1937. She made him say things, terrible things, things I don't want to repeat. And then she made him cut her. Not deep, just enough to draw blood. And she collected that blood in a little silver cup. Was Celestine's testimony accurate, or had decades of nightmares and whispered stories distorted her memory of that night? We cannot know for certain. What is documented in contemporary records is that the gathering at Bellefontaine lasted until well past midnight, and that Cora Mae was last seen being led away from the main house by Samuel Broussard and two other men at approximately 11 o'clock. She was never seen again. In the days following the gathering, the official story was that Cora Mae had fled. Margaret told anyone who asked that the woman had been dismissed from service and had left the plantation of her own accord, likely heading north to escape her shame. But the workers at Bellefontaine knew better. They knew that Cora Mae's mother, Delphine, had not been informed of her daughter's departure. They knew that all of Cora Mae's possessions remained in her quarters, her few dresses, her grandmother's herb collection, the small wooden cross that had hung above her bed since childhood. And they knew that on the morning after the gathering, they had seen Broussard and his men returning from the direction of the cane fields with mud on their boots and shovels in their hands. The workers spoke in whispers, as they always did when discussing the business of the big house, but this time the whispers carried a weight of horror that was new. Old Isaiah Green, who had been enslaved at Bellefontaine since before the war and had seen things that should have broken any man, was heard to say that what happened that night was worse than anything he had witnessed in 60 years. 3 days after the gathering, Delphine approached Margaret and demanded to know what had happened to her daughter. It was an act of extraordinary courage, or perhaps desperation. In 1892 Louisiana, a black woman confronting a white mistress could expect nothing but punishment. According to kitchen workers who witnessed the confrontation, Margaret's response was chilling in its calmness. "Your daughter brought this upon herself. She succumbed to the temptations of the flesh and led a godly man into sin. Whatever has befallen her is the Lord's judgment, not mine. If you value your position here, you will not ask again." Delphine did not ask again, not publicly at least, but she was seen that same night walking into the cane fields, carrying a lantern and calling her daughter's name. She searched for hours, her voice growing hoarse and desperate, until finally the light of her lantern disappeared into the darkness and did not return. Her body was found the next morning, floating face down in a drainage canal. The official cause of death was drowning, ruled an accident. But those who prepared her body for burial noticed marks around her throat that suggested she had not gone into the water voluntarily. Within a week, 2 more deaths would follow. A field worker named Moses, who had been heard asking questions about Cora Mae's whereabouts, was killed when a wagon axle supposedly gave way and crushed him against a barn wall. And Samuel Broussard's youngest brother, a man named Pierre, who had participated in leading Cora Mae away that night, was found hanging from a cypress tree at the edge of the bayou, a note in his pocket that simply read, "God forgive me." After the deaths, a silence descended upon Bellefontaine. Not the peaceful silence of acceptance, but the tense, watchful silence of fear. The workers went about their duties with their heads down and their mouths closed. Questions were not asked, names were not spoken. It was as though the entire community had agreed, without ever discussing it, to pretend that Cora Mae had never existed. Elijah Dunham retreated entirely into himself. He stopped riding through the fields, stopped appearing at meals, stopped speaking to anyone except when absolutely necessary. He moved through the house like a ghost, his footsteps soundless, his presence barely acknowledged. Workers reported seeing him, standing at the window of his study for hours, staring out at the cane fields with an expression of such profound desolation that even those who blamed him for Cora Mae's fate found it difficult to look at him. He began drinking heavily, something he had never done before. Bottles of whiskey would disappear from the pantry, and in the early morning hours, servants could hear him moving through the darkened house, mumbling to himself, occasionally calling out a name that everyone recognized, but no one dared acknowledge. Margaret, by contrast, seemed energized by the events. She threw herself into her charitable works with renewed vigor, organized prayer meetings twice weekly, and spoke often and publicly about the importance of maintaining moral standards in a world that was rapidly descending into chaos. She gave lectures on the dangers of miscegenation. She donated generously to organizations dedicated to preserving what she called the natural order of society. To outside observers, she appeared to be a woman at peace with herself and her God, but those who worked closest to her noticed changes. She began locking herself in her chambers at odd hours, emerging pale and distracted. She developed a habit of speaking to herself, carrying on one-sided conversations with an invisible presence, and she became obsessed with a particular area of the cane fields, a low-lying section near the bayou that she would visit daily, standing at its edge and staring at the ground for long minutes before returning to the house. It was from this same area that the sounds began. The first reports came from field workers during the 1893 harvest, almost exactly 1 year after Cora Mae's disappearance. A group of cane cutters working near the bayou claimed to have heard singing rising from somewhere beneath them. A woman's voice, beautiful and mournful, performing a melody none of them recognized. When they stopped their work to listen, the singing stopped when they resumed cutting, so did the voice. Over the following months, the reports multiplied. Workers heard not just singing, but screaming, anguished cries that seemed to come from underground, from beneath the very soil they walked upon. Some reported seeing lights moving through the cane at night, pale blue flames that drifted and danced in ways that no natural fire should move. And several claimed to have seen a woman standing at the edge of the fields at dusk, a young black woman, in a white dress, who vanished whenever anyone approached. By 1895, Bellefontaine had become a place that people avoided after dark. Workers demanded higher wages to stay past sunset. Neighboring families stopped accepting invitations to the house, and the whispers that had once circulated only among the black community began to spread to white ears as well. Whispers about what really happened on the eve of the harvest, about where Cora Mae's body might be hidden, and about what Margaret Dunham might have done to ensure that the truth would never be known. Elijah Dunham died in the spring of 1901, officially of a stroke, though some said he had simply lost the will to live. He was found in his study, slumped over his desk, a pen in his hand and a half-written letter before him. The letter was addressed to "My dearest C," and contained only a single completed sentence. "I have waited for you every night, but you never come." The servants who found him reported, that his face bore an expression of profound peace, the first peace, they said, that they had seen on his features in nearly a decade. Some whispered that he had finally been released from whatever torment had gripped him since that October night. Others, more cynically, suggested that death was simply the only escape left to him. Margaret outlived him by 6 years, dying in 1907 at the age of 62. In her final months, according to the woman who nursed her, she was plagued by hallucinations and terrors that no amount of prayer could dispel. She would wake screaming in the night, clawing at her bedclothes as though trying to escape from something that was holding her down. She spoke often of the girl in the field and begged repeatedly for forgiveness from someone who was not there. The nurse, a woman named Marie Fontenot, would later describe Margaret's final days in a letter to her sister. "The mistress has lost all sense of time and place. She thinks she is back in that parlor on that night. She keeps asking if the witnesses have arrived. She keeps saying she must show them what happens to sinners, and then she screams and screams and screams, but she never says what she sees that frightens her so." Her final words, recorded by her nurse, were, "She won't stop singing. Make her stop. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her to stop singing." After Margaret's death, Bellefontaine passed to a distant cousin who had no interest in sugar cultivation. The house was boarded up, the fields left to grow wild, and within a decade the plantation had been reclaimed by the swamp from which it had been carved. The grand house with its 12 white columns slowly sank into the earth, swallowed by vegetation and decay. But the story did not end there. In 1937, a professor of folklore from Louisiana State University named Dr. Etienne Arsenault visited St. Martin Parish to collect oral histories from elderly residents. Among those he interviewed was Celestine Landry, the woman who had been a child servant at Bellefontaine on the night of the punishment. Her testimony, recorded in Arsenault's papers, provided the first detailed account of what had happened in the parlor that October evening. Arsenault also located and interviewed Samuel Broussard's daughter, a woman named Mathilde, who had been born several years after the events in question. According to Mathilde, her father had been haunted by guilt until the day he died in 1919. In his final years, he had become increasingly convinced that something was watching him, something that waited for him in the dark. "Papa used to say he could hear her singing," Mathilde told Arsenault. "He said she was under the ground, in that place where they put her, and she was singing to remind them of what they'd done. He said he'd give anything to forget that voice, but he never could." When pressed about the location of that place, Mathilde claimed not to know precisely, but she believed it was somewhere in the low-lying area near the bayou, the same area where Margaret had made her daily visits and from which the sounds had first been reported. In 1954, a construction crew preparing to lay a pipeline through the former Bellefontaine property made a disturbing discovery. Approximately 6 feet below the surface, in soil that should have been too waterlogged to preserve much of anything, they unearthed human remains. The skeleton was that of a young woman. She had been buried in a makeshift grave, wrapped in what appeared to be the remnants of a white cotton dress. Around her neck was a silver chain, bearing a small pendant. A pendant that, according to Samuel Broussard's deposition from 1903, had been described by Elijah Dunham as a gift he had given to Cora Mae. But it was what was found with the remains that most disturbed the investigators. Scattered around the bones were dozens of small objects: iron, nails, bits of broken glass, animal teeth, and scraps of parchment covered in symbols that no one could identify. The arrangement was not random. The objects had been placed in a specific pattern around the body, forming a rough circle with the skeleton at its center. A local priest who examined the site declared it the work of dark practices and refused to say more, A professor of anthropology from Tulane who was consulted suggested the arrangement resembled protective wards found in various folk magic traditions, wards designed not to harm the dead but to keep them in place, to prevent them from rising. The remains were eventually interred in an unmarked grave in a cemetery outside St. Martinville. No positive identification was ever made. By 1954, there was no one left alive who could have identified Cora Mae with certainty, and the forensic technology of the era was insufficient for more scientific methods. But those who knew the story had no doubt about whose bones had been found in that waterlogged grave. In 1973, a graduate student researching Louisiana folk beliefs visited the site of the former Bellefontaine Plantation. She recorded her experience in a journal that was later published as part of a collection of supernatural encounters. According to her account, she arrived at the location shortly before sunset on an October evening. The area was completely overgrown. Nothing remained of the grand house, except a few foundation stones and the stumps of what might once have been the famous white columns. The bayou had crept closer over the decades, and much of the former cane fields were now underwater. As the sun began to set, she reported feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness, not fear, but a deep, bone-deep melancholy that brought tears to her eyes. And then, just as the last light faded from the sky, she heard it. A woman's voice, rising from somewhere in the flooded fields, singing a melody she had never heard before. The song lasted for perhaps 30 seconds before fading into silence. When she tried to describe it later, she said only this: "It was the saddest sound I have ever heard. It was the sound of someone who had been waiting for a very long time, and who knew they would have to wait forever." What really happened at Bellefontaine on the eve of the harvest in 1892? After more than a century, we are left with fragments, letters that no longer exist, testimonies from witnesses, long dead, bones that could never be positively identified, and a melody that still drifts across the Louisiana bayou on certain October evenings. The truth, whatever it may be, is buried beneath layers of time, silence, and the murky waters of Bayou Teche. But from those fragments, several theories have emerged, each one attempting to explain the inexplicable, to make sense of the senseless. The first, and most straightforward, holds that Margaret Dunham orchestrated Cora Mae's murder out of simple jealousy and rage. In this version of events, the ritual aspects of the punishment were nothing more than theatrical cruelty, a way for a deeply religious woman to frame her revenge as righteous judgment, to cloak murder in the language of divine retribution. Cora Mae was killed that night, buried hastily in the low field, and the subsequent deaths were either accidents, suicides driven by unbearable guilt, or deliberate silencing of potential witnesses who knew too much. The supernatural phenomena, mass hysteria, guilt-induced hallucinations, and the natural human tendency to create ghost stories around places where terrible things have happened. The second theory takes the testimonies of Celestine Landry and others more literally. This version suggests that Margaret's religious obsession had led her to darker practices, that the Black Book and the strange symbols were real, that she had attempted some kind of binding ritual to punish not just Cora Mae but her husband as well. Whether she was trying to curse them, to damn their souls, or to achieve something even stranger is unclear. But the supernatural phenomena reported at Bellefontaine in the years that followed suggest that whatever Margaret attempted that night had consequences she did not anticipate. A third theory, proposed by Dr. Arsenault in his 1938 paper on Louisiana folklore, is perhaps the most disturbing of all. Arsenault noted the protective wards found around Cora Mae's remains and the specific nature of the hauntings reported, the singing, the lights, the figure in white. He suggested that Margaret had not tried to curse Cora Mae, but to bind her, to trap her spirit in the place where her body lay, to prevent her from finding peace, to ensure that she would spend eternity imprisoned in the very soil of Bellefontaine. If Arsenault's theory is correct, then what visitors to the site have reported hearing is not a haunting in the traditional sense. It is something closer to a prison sentence, a woman condemned to sing forever in the darkness beneath the earth, waiting for a release that will never come. Today, nothing remains of Bellefontaine except rumors and ruins. The land has been absorbed into a wildlife preserve, and the exact location of the old plantation is known only to a handful of local historians and folklore enthusiasts. The bayou has continued its slow advance, and much of what was once dry ground is now permanently flooded. But people still hear the singing. Fishermen on Bayou Teche report it most often, a woman's voice drifting across the water at dusk, beautiful and unbearably sad. Some say it's just the wind in the cypress trees. Others say it's a trick of acoustics, sounds carrying strangely across the water. But those who know the story of Cora Mae have a different explanation. They say she's still there, still waiting, still singing the song she was singing on that October afternoon when the world she knew came to an end. They say she's waiting for someone to find her, to break the bonds that Margaret Dunham laid upon her more than a century ago. They say she'll keep singing until someone finally sets her free, and to this day, no one knows the truth. Perhaps no one ever will. What do you think happened at Bellefontaine? Was Margaret Dunham simply a jealous wife driven to murder? Or did she tap into something darker, something that trapped Cora Mae in an eternal prison of her own making? Share your theories in the comments below. I read every single one, and the best theories might just be featured in a future episode. If this story has haunted you the way it's haunted me, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell. We have many more journeys to take together, many more shadows to explore, and if you want to become part of our haunted community, leave a comment below telling me what story you'd like me to investigate next. Until then, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, some secrets are buried for a reason. This has been another journey into the shadows. Thank you for walking this path with me. Good night.